Okay, Kevin, thanks a lot for the rear suspension video. I'm looking forward to the front suspension video. So what kind of settings do I need to make on the front to complement the rear, and then put it all together, go to the track and improve my 60-foot times and have a safe vehicle at the same time? Hey guys, welcome back to Kevin Wilson SBC. I want to continue with our A-body 64 to 72 Gen 1 and Gen 2s. This video is going to focus on the front suspension, and then we're going to tie together the front suspension and the rear suspension video, part 1. And we're going to close out this with the instant centers explained for slicks and drag radials. So thanks for supporting the channel. Let's jump in and start talking about A-body front suspension. Let's jump in and cover 3 very fundamental aspects that will set the stage for the rest of this video. And here's my commitment to you. Less wordiness, more facts. Let's roll. Camber. On this board, the front is going to be there when we're talking about suspension, but on these 3 we got to change our perspective. So on the camber, we are looking at the front of the vehicle. So from your view, this is the front, and this is the front of the tire, back of the tire. On the camber, you're looking at the front of the vehicle, standing up, looking at the front wheels as if the front fenders were gone, and you're looking to see if the tires are laying in straight or laying out. If they're laying in on the top, if the tops are closer to each other than the bottoms, this is negative camber. If the tire is straight up and down perpendicular to the ground, we call this 0 degrees camber. If the tops are laying out and further away from each other than the bottoms of the front tires, we call that positive camber. And in this scenario for drag racing, I'm not talking about round track. If you're making a left-hand or right-hand turn between the starting line and the finish line, we have other problems we need to discuss. With regard to drag racing, I'm going to set my Gen 1 or Gen 2 at 0 degrees camber, or as close to 0 degrees as I can get it. There are challenges with these cars and camber and caster we're going to talk about later. But if I have to err on one side or the other, because of how the A-body front end is going to react on rise, if I have to, I'll put the camber at 1/4 degrees positive, so 0.25 positive, because as the front end comes up and as the A-body articulates, so as the chassis rises and the front end begins to have travel on the A-body, the tires and camber are going to go negative. So if I start you at around 1/4 positive, between 0.15 to 0.25 positive at ride height, sitting still, as you launch the car and the front end comes in, your camber is going to be close to 0. Now, there are control arms and there are aftermarket things to help solve some of this camber swing, and ball joint height, spindle height, and control arm angles will help with that articulation. So if we've solved that problem and we don't have a lot of camber swing on the front end rise, then I'm going to set that accordingly. We may have it close to 0 at ride height because you're not going to get a lot of negative camber going down the track. Caster. A lot of people get confused over caster. I'm sorry I didn't make this bigger. The two red dots represent the relationship of the upper and lower ball joint. You are looking at the front passenger wheel and tire. Front of the car is here. This is your upper ball joint or upper strut mount. We're talking A bodies here, so forget struts. You have an upper and lower ball joint. All right, here's your upper ball joint. Here's your lower ball joint. This picture has the axis of these two laying back. So from the top to the bottom, the axis is laying back. That is positive caster. The yellow dots represent the upper and lower ball joint being perpendicular to each other. Not ahead, not back, straight perpendicular. That's 0 degrees caster. If your upper ball joint is further ahead than your lower ball joint, then we call that negative caster, and that's not what we want. We don't want 0. We don't want negative. We're shooting for positive caster. And in the Gen 1, Gen 2s, GM hadn't figured this out yet. They really didn't figure caster out until the mid-80s. So a lot of our Gen 1s and Gen 2s have very little caster. And if you've lowered the vehicle and you're still running stock control arms and stock ball joint heights, then you're doggone near 0 degrees caster. Most alignment shops are really going to struggle to get more than 0 to 1 degree caster positive. I'm going to put you at 3.5 to 6 degrees because I'm going to use some aftermarket upper control arms. I'm going to use an offset shaft. I got all this in the description. I got all of this described in the description, and we're going to talk about it more later. But I'm going to get your car to at least 3.5 degrees caster, and I'm shooting for up to 6 degrees caster. Now, I've had comments. It's amazing how many experts are out there, and we've been doing front end alignments and chassis work since I was in diapers. I was born in '69. Dad's been doing it long before I was born, building chassis from the ground up, drawing them out on the garage floor in chalk, and then welding them based on all of his geometry and measurements in chalk. Dad has been doing front end alignments before I was born, and I think he understands what he's doing. People tell me, why you don't need so much caster. The 48 Ford, I'm running the Southside Machine Upper control arms with a 1-inch longer ball joint, and they are fully adjustable rod ends, no bushings anywhere, solid mount rod ends, and we run 7 degrees of caster in the 48 Ford. And going down the track, once the car settles, I can let go of the steering wheel and it drives straight down the track. Positive caster is going to keep straight line acceleration going straight. And I'm going to want the same amount of caster on the driver's side as the passenger side. Normally on a street car, we don't do that because of the crown in the road. So you kind of have to correct caster to drive the car straight. Caster also influences corner weight. And sometimes in a drag car, you will use caster to move weight to the front wheel off the rear wheel. If I increase the caster on the front driver's side, I'm going to shift weight to that wheel, and I'm going to pull weight off of the right rear slick or radial by doing that. Caster is critical. And no, you don't need as much as I run in my Altered. The Altered has 13 degrees of caster, the front engine Altered I have. We don't need that, but we need at least 3.5, and I'm going to shoot for 5 to 6. Toe in. Okay, if you lay down on the ground in front of your tires and looking underneath the car, and you look at the front tread of each tire. So you're laying down on the ground in front of your car and you're looking down underneath the chassis, and you see these two front tires, and if they are pointed into each other, that's toe in. If they're pointed straight ahead, that's 0 degrees toe. If they're pointed out, they're toed out. So that's what this is representing. From the front to the rear on each tire, if they're further apart in the front, they're toed out. If they're dead even, they're 0. If they're pointed in the front and further apart in the back, that's toe in. We're shooting for toe in. Okay? And if I can get you at 0 and I can get you at 6 degrees, I'm going to put you at a 1/16 in. I want a little bit of toe in versus toe out. Think about it. As if with toe out, as the car is going down the track and you have the weight of the motor coming back down as the suspension settles and you got toe out, you are pulling apart on the tie rod ends and the drag links. You're trying to pull those front wheels out even more as they scrub on the track. And you're putting all of that pressure on those components. With a little bit of toe in, the scrub is going to keep the tires pointed, and you're trying to compress the components, which are much stronger under compression than they are trying to be ripped apart. That's important to understand. 1/16 of an inch toe in, 3.5 to 6 degrees of positive caster, and I'm shooting for 0 degrees camber as the car goes down the track. I really am not too concerned where camber is at ride height, okay, with driver in it. What I'm concerned about is, does the car have a negative camber swing because of the control arms and ball joints? I don't know what your car has. Let's say your car does have a 1/4 of a degree camber swing negative as the front end comes up. If so, at ride height, I'm going to put them at a 1/4 positive. So as you launch and go down the track and the front end separates and lifts to put weight on the back, the tires are going to be straight up and down. I'm going to have the most contact path on the track for steering stability, which is going to help my caster keep the front end planted and driving straight with a 1/16 of an inch toe in. It's the entire combination that works together. I have a front end video that goes into a lot more detail on this. I'll have it in the description below, but these are key components that we must keep in mind as we progress through this video series on front end suspension, Gen 1, Gen 2s. Okay, let's continue with the front suspension and let's get into details on what do we need to do to get this front suspension of your Gen 1, Gen 2A body working at the drag strip. Obviously, most of us are going to be running a car, an A body that has been lowered. And when you lower the vehicle, especially in the front, let's face it, the Gen 1, Gen 2s didn't have the most ideal control arm angles from GM. So whenever we're trying to get our stance and get the center of gravity different on the car, and for a prepped drag strip, a lower center of gravity with especially a radial tire is your friend. If we're running slicks at the track, then a little higher center of gravity is your friend, depending on power levels. So if you have 500 to 700, 800 horsepower, 400 to 800, the lower the horsepower, the more advantage of having a higher center of gravity, because it's going to be easier to move, transfer weight load to the rear suspension and help keep the slicks planted, and even provide a little more compression on the shocks and springs for the slicks. Remember now, too much anti-squat can really upset the sidewall of a slick. So with a small tire slick, I'm really hoping you're running tubes, because a tube is really going to help support the weight of the vehicle and allow the sidewall to help provide traction. If you're not running tubes and your small tire slick, the sidewall is having to support the weight of the vehicle and try to provide traction with the wrinkle. So we want to make sure if you're a small tire slick, you're running tubes. When you lower the front or change the stance of the front and you're running a slick, then you are working against some of that weight transfer. But as we go up in power levels, then if you have a high center of gravity, we're going to begin to have problems with wheelies. And when you are wheeling, it makes a great picture. It's cool, but it's not winning races. When the front wheels are off the ground, that steering wheel just doesn't do a whole lot for you. And with that in mind, if your car does wheelie, I hope you have some type of identifying tape on that steering wheel. So when the wheels come up, you know where straight is. Because if you're not used to that and it pulls the front wheels and you start trying to steer the car because it's going left or right, and you start, let's say your car is going left, your wheels are in the air, the natural instinct, your brain says, turn the wheel, and you turn the wheel and then realize, well, that's not going to work. And then you lift and let the front end come down and your wheels are turned to the right. Guess what's going to happen? That car is going to come down, jerk to the right. You're going to panic. You're going to counter steer all the way to the left, and the car is going to come around. And if you have any mile per hour, you're going to the guardrail. On the front end, so from the factory, we're looking at the front of the car here. And most Gen 1, Gen 2s that come to our shop already are experiencing what we call sag. And what that means is you got your front frame rails, okay? This is not to scale. I keep saying that on everything. And then you have your control arm mounting pad here. And then you have your driver side frame rail. And you have your control arm mounting pad here. Now they're not straight, they're at an angle. And then of course you have your factory cross member. When we get cars into the shop in the Gen 1 era, then what we begin to notice is sag. And what happens is these frame rails begin to sag in towards each other. And that's natural, especially in the big block cars. There's a lot of weight on this front cross member. And what happens is, because of that frame sag, what you begin to have is negative camber. So remember last night when I showed you from the front of the vehicle this. The tops of the tires are laying in. And this frame sag is really screwing with your front end geometry. And it's very difficult on a Gen 1, Gen 2 A-body that has had this sag. It's very difficult to correct all of this camber problem without two things. The very first thing you can do is strap the frame down on a frame machine and pull these frame rails back apart. And when you do that, you can get your camber back. Every time you pull a frame, you weaken it. We're talking about 50-plus-year-old metallurgy and frame. You can employ upper control arm offset shafts. I had to go get my hat, guys, sorry. With an offset shaft, you have the ability to correct camber. And that offset shaft is going to give you more ability to correct caster, because whenever you have a frame sag issue like this, it absolutely impacts camber. But when that frame sags, you're impacting caster at the same time, and obviously you're impacting toe end, because anytime camber changes on an A body, your toe end is going to change. just because of the geometry of the suspension. An offset shaft is highly recommended. As a matter of fact, what I would recommend is replacing the upper control arm with an aftermarket control arm. You're going to get a lighter upper control arm, and on the G-body front end on the 48, we run the Global West TLC Racing lower control arms, and they come with improved bushings, Delrin bushings. The stock factory rubber bushings are tight. The front end doesn't articulate well. The A-arms are really bound up, and it really hurts to launch because you need the front end of the car as free as possible and not in a bind because of the bushings. So the Global West drag TLC upper and lower control arms are a great investment and upgrade to your car. Those control arms don't come with an offset shaft, but you have the option to have them install the offset shaft in the drag racing control arms. The reason why they don't install the offset shaft in the control arm is because they've already built in some camber and caster corrections with the normal shaft in the control arm. As a matter of fact, they've built in 4 to 5 degrees of caster for the A-body Chevelles. And they've also going to give you a little more camber correction. But if you have a situation where your frame has sagged, and when you do all the removal of shims that you can on your alignment bolts, and you're still negative, let's say you take out all the shims that greatly impact camber. On a control arm, you normally have one end that really moves camber, and then you have one that really moves caster. If you take all your shims out and you still have negative camber, and I'm talking like -1 or more degrees of camber, then you're gonna need an offset shaft to get the camber back close to 0. And what I would recommend is, if you're gonna do that, go ahead and ditch the factory upper control arm, put it in the garage, put it in storage, so if in the future you ever have a buyer for your car, you can say, hey, I still have all the OEM pieces. But what you're going to get is you're going to get a stronger, lighter upper and lower control arm. You're going to have a lower control arm with a much stronger and improved spring pocket and shock mount perch. And now think about a big block Chevelle that picks the front wheels up about 1.5 to 2 inches and carries them out and sits it down. Imagine one that pulls the front wheels, a couple feet in the air, and that front end comes back down. Imagine all of the pounds of force that bottom lower control arm spring pocket and shock mount area is facing. The Global West, and I'm not sponsored by Global West, and there are many people, Southside Machine Performance, we're running their upper control arms on the 48 Ford, and I'm running the Global West TLC drag racing lowers. There are many people who make this stuff. This is just an example. But the Global West lower TLC control arms has a much beefier spring pocket and shock mount perch for that very reason. So we're going to need to correct the camber. We need to free up the upper and lower control arms. I also recommend, with a lowered front suspension, that you run a 1-inch longer ball joint. Now let me explain why. I'm not a huge fan of the modified spindles where the upper ball joint spindle mounts higher up. I generally like the stock spindles. Okay, so you have your stock upper control arms. That's supposed to be a ball joint. Wow, guys, I'm terrible at drawing. Then you have your lowers. I don't want to get into roll center, but it does impact the handling of your drag car to some degree. Now remember, when you're talking about roll center, and we haven't talked about it, but there are many, many opinions on roll center and everything else. But when you see people talking about roll center, you're generally talking about autocross cars, round track cars, Indy cars, because roll center is definitely going to impact the ability of a car to have more or less body roll. And in a drag racing application, while it's important to the stability of the car, because you don't know if your car on the top end is going to get loose or not. And God forbid the rear end starts coming out from under you, or you hit some fluid that the other guy left on the track and no one knew it, and your car begins to do this. If your roll center is not right and that car begins to roll, because on the front end of most cars, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, well, let's talk about it now. I remove the front sway bar. And I usually have a little stronger spring and shocks in the car to control it. Now let me say this, let me put a disclaimer. If your car has a lot of front body roll, now remember we're running a rear ARB, a rear anti-roll bar, that's going to help a lot. But do not go take your front sway bar off because KevinWilsonSBC said so. You have to take other measures to keep control of the front end in the event something like this happens on the top end and you're trying to control the car. If you've removed the front sway bar and you don't have a good roll center set up on your car and you get loose and you start having front body roll, then you're in trouble. You're going to hit the guardrail, which guardrails are freaking dangerous, or you're going to go into the concrete barrier, and God forbid, worse yet, you're going to go into a barrel roll. And if you don't have a full cage with halo and seat belts to protect you, and you go in a barrel roll, the chances of survival are slim to none. So it is important to understand roll center. It's just, I'm not going to go into that in this video. All right, but when you lower your car, what begins to happen is now, instead of having a center line like that, what you're doing is you're now bringing this position down because the chassis went down, and now you have this, and now you have this on the lower. Whenever you start having changes like this, now you start impacting geometry. And in this situation, when you've lowered it with the stock length ball joint, you're really kind of getting some geometry issues introduced. So by running a 1 inch taller ball joint, I am bringing the ball joint mount point up to get more of this and less of this. Like I said, I'm not getting into roll center in this video, but trust me, getting that upper control arm at more of a downhill rake is your friend because of what you've done down here to this lower control arm when you lower the chassis. Also, I would recommend that while you're doing all this, I'm not a huge fan of factory coil springs. And listen, I've read some of the comments and I understand not everyone has, $15,000 to put into the front end of their Chevelle. But there are just some key things that I'm not going to compromise on with the front. If I'm taking a Gen 1 or Gen 2 A-body out and I'm seriously drag racing it, it's street and strip, but when I go to the strip, I want to win. I don't want to go to the strip and pound my car for 6 or 7 laps and not win and just go out and test. If I'm going to do it, I want to win. So I would invest in a set of coilover conversions. There are many companies who make coilover conversions that will bolt up to the stock mount lower control arm and come right through the frame where the stock shock mounts. You don't have to buy the coilover converted control arms that are $200 to $300 more than these Global West things. Global West sells them. A lot of people sell them. But you don't have to do that. There are people out there who make a shock and coilover spring to fit in the factory location. I would be doing that at this point. I would get rid of that GM spring, and let's face it, most of us have either cut a coil off of it, or we've heated it and lowered the vehicle, or we're running the Moroso trick springs. And you really don't have a lot of options. If you run the small block trick spring and you have a big block car, you're going to collapse the coil spring. If you run a big block Moroso trick spring and you're running a small block, then you've got one heck of a stiff spring and you're really going to struggle. And I've seen guys with small blocks do that and then take the dang spring and cut a coil off or heat it up and lower it. The minute you cut a pigtail off or a ring, or the minute you heat that spring, you are changing the characteristics of that spring. And we can argue that all day long, but you are. So I would recommend putting a set of coilovers in and get the spring rate you need to support the weight of your front end. Another thing, with a lowered stance, you may have to consider a bump steer kit. And generally, all you're going to be doing with a bump steer kit is you're going to be lowering where the outer tie rods mount to the spindle. And it doesn't take a lot. A 1/4 inch makes a huge difference to control bump steer. And bump steer is what is, whenever the front end lifts and the tires go negative, bump steer is what's going to help correct toe end changes as your camber changes. And you can see cars who experience this when the front wheels come down and you see a front wheel shake, like in this video right here. And what that did was it ripped the factory rag joint that was still installed in this car. And when the factory rag joint ripped, there was no steering. And thank God Bobby didn't get hurt from this. And it happened in the first 75 to 100 foot of the run. But thank God this didn't happen or come apart on the top end. But that bump steer, shocking those front tires, shaking that toe in and out violently, ripping the rag joint, put the car into wall. Which leads me to this. Please eliminate the rag joint here. And what am I so adamant about? I want you to take a look at this steering shaft that comes out of the firewall and goes down to the steering box. Just a manual GM steering box. You will not see a rubber rag joint anywhere in this system. From the steering wheel, through the firewall, to the steering box is all solid. You remove the rag joint, you put a U-joint up here where the rag joint was. You put U-joint on the steering box, and you run a double D shaft between the two. You have a free joint on both ends, the car's not in a bind, and everything's good. So we eliminate the rag joint. And then if your car was equipped with a power steering box and you've eliminated the power steering pump to get the 5 or 6 horsepower, which, hey, I don't blame you. I want every ounce of horsepower I can get. I don't want anything robbing my car of horsepower. But if you've got a power steering pump, power steering gearbox, and you don't have a power steering pump, please consider a full manual gearbox on, steering box on. It's going to be lighter, you can get some better ratios, and it's going to give you better steering than trying to run a power steering gearbox without a power steering pump. I don't want to argue filling or putting some fluid in the pump and creating a loop back hose, I'm not going to argue that. The reason why I'm taking the power steering gearbox off is to save weight and get a little better ratio in my steering. Those are very key components for the front upper lower control arms and steering leakage. Obviously at this time, when you're doing all this, please consider new tie rod ends, drag links, check your pitman arm. This is the time to put better components on in those places. If you're replacing the upper and lower control arms, they're going to come with new ball joints. They're going to come with new bushings. They're going to articulate freely. They're not going to be in a bind. And not only that, the upper control arm shafts are not going to have bolts holding them together. They're going to come through the bushing, and you're going to be able to put lock nuts on that shaft to ensure nothing's coming apart. Those are key things on the front end. Now let's change gears. Now let's talk about instant centers. All right, we got our anti-squat line here. Let's tie this together with the part 1 video. This is our anti-squat line. All right, instead of using chalk, I'm going to use white. Let's say this is our center of gravity. Remember, the anti-squat line starts in the center of the slick where the slick is sitting on the track. And the anti-squat line, you go to your front spindle center line and you come up to the height of the center of gravity. It's important to know the height of the center of gravity, and out here where you can't see, you have your upper and lower control arm, and you have a spindle, and what you're going to do is the center line of that spindle to the ground, and where it intersects with this line is where this line goes through. So it starts there and comes to where the slick meets the road. That is your vehicle's anti-squat line. Now you know the center of gravity and how far it is from this front spindle because you've weighed the car, and I have a video that covers all of this, but you know the front weight and the rear weight, so that gives you the distance the center of gravity is from the front spindle's center line. And I also tell you how to get the exact height. But what most of us do is to get close and use this line as a center of reference and then video watch the car and make an educated change. We'll use the height of the camshaft as the center of gravity height. And guys, while not exact, that gets you pretty close. And you're like, man, how the heck am I going to find the height of the camshaft? Well, measure with the car level the center line of the crankshaft bolt to the ground, and then we know the distance from the center line of the crank to the center line of the cam for a small block Chevrolet and for a big block Chevrolet. So you just add the two together and now you have your height. All right, let's start off with slicks. Small tire slicks with tubes. This is very important that you have tubes, because with a tube I can get more aggressive with my anti-squat. This is my instant center. I'm going to be about right there. I'm going to be behind the center of gravity. If I'm making good power, and when I say good power, let's say naturally aspirated big block, let's say I'm making 650 to 700 horsepower. The more horsepower, then a little further back from the center of gravity. As you get out here, you're going to begin to have more wheel stands than you want, because you have more of an instant center length and you have less weight in front of your instant center length. And the less weight, the easier it is to pick up. So let's say big block, 454. I'm going to be behind the center of gravity, probably around 3 to 4 inches behind the center of gravity, and I'm going to be just a hair above the anti-squat line. Let's call this 105% anti-squat. Yes, I'm going to have a slick with tubes with a little bit of rear separation. Now I'm going to have some shocks that have some good valving to not crush the sidewall of the slick, but I'm going to run a small tire slick with tubes a little bit above the anti-squat line. Remember, extremes are not your friends when it comes to slicks. I could also do this and run it around 95% anti-squat. And at that point, I'm not going to have a lot of separation. I'm going to introduce a little more weight transfer. And now the compression side of my shock becomes critical. And I don't want to have the shock collapse and damage the shock because I'm hitting the body. But now I can run a little bit of squat. If I'm not running tubes, if I refuse to install tubes and I'm running a small tire slick, then I'm going to come a little bit below the anti-squat line. I'm going to stay behind the center of gravity because now I don't have tubes, and I can upset the sidewall pretty quick. And if you really upset the sidewall too much, I see guys keep adding air pressure, and air pressure. You got to be careful with that because while it may help not kill the sidewall, if you keep adding air pressure, you will get to a point where you're not going to have adequate traction on the top end because you got too much air in your slicks, especially on the 1, 2, and 2, 3 gear change, where you can break loose and now you're skating on what feels like ice because you have too much air in your slick. So be careful adding too much air to a slick. There's a reason why a slick works with lower air pressure than a radial. And if you're not careful, you get out of balance. Now you've got a problem on the top end. Now you're in trouble. With tubes, I'm going to run behind the center of gravity and a little bit over. Now, yep, I'm going to get comments. Kevin, I'm running small tire slicks and I have 120% anti-squat. Yep, you can do that. And you're going to need to have some valving in your shocks to help control that. So that's slicks with tubes. I'm going to be 105 to 110. Can you get to 120? Sure, your car might be able to. But I'm not going to start you there. Okay, let's call this probably around 55 inches to 60 inches instant center length. And the height, based on your anti-squat line, don't get overly concerned with the height with the small tire slicks. It's going to fall where it is based on your anti-squat line. Now radials, we're changing a bunch with a radial. With a radial, I'm going to probably be in this zone to start off with. And I'm going to probably start you around 125% anti-squat, which is conservative for a radial car. We're going to be considerably shorter. We're going to be in the 36 to 45 inch range. And we're going to be much more above the anti-squat line. This is absolutely going to introduce rear separation, and you're going to absolutely need to have the shocks to control the rear suspension, because with a radial, I need the shock to keep extending at least through the first 1.5 seconds of the run, preferably to 3 seconds of the run. If I extend the shock before this, and I have all the travel the shock can give, I'm going to hook, and as I get out, before the 60 foot, I'm going to light up the radials. We're going to go into spin. We're going to hook and spin. If I spin immediately with my radial, then I've either got too much extension valving, or I don't have enough compression valving to keep it planted to the track, or I'm not hitting the radial hard enough, or I got too much air pressure in the radial. I've seen guys running 22, 24 pounds of air pressure in radials and not understand why the car spins immediately on the hit. Start your radial around 16 pounds. Most guys end up 17 to 18, but bring it down to 16. Don't start off at 20. Give yourself a little sidewall action and go from there. But if you're spinning right off the hit, then you can bring this up, or bring it back, or both. But make one change at a time. If it were me and I spun directly on the hit, then I'm going to try to bring it up a hair. But let's be real. Let's say I had a good, let's say I had 15 degrees upper bar angle, and that's ridiculous. That's 45 degrees. But let's say I had an upper bar angle of 15 degrees, and my lower bar was just barely uphill at this right here, and I spun immediately on the hit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lower this bottom bar to this. It's going to shorten it and pick it up, because I'm changing the height of the instant center line for this one. This one stays the same. So if you drew a line, and you drew a line, and then you drew a line here, it came back and up. That's what I would do. Now this is kind of extreme. But by introducing that, I shorten, I lift the instant center, and that will plant the radial harder. I'm going to confirm my air pressure. I'm going to bring the air pressure down to 16, and I'm going to hit it. And I may loosen extension a couple clicks. Generally 2 to 3 clicks is what you need to be changing to see a change, depending on how advanced your shocks are. And when I loosen rebound, so this is rebound, I'm going to loosen it. So I'm going to go negative, and I may add 1 to 2 clicks of compression, so that when the shock extends and I hit the sidewall and the sidewall begins to resist, the natural tendency is to come back and compress the shock, and that allows the sidewall to unload. This is why we run double adjustable shocks. I can independently adjust extension and compression and not impact the two. This is how I would set the instant center up on slicks with tubes, slicks without tubes, and radials. I really hope this has helped you. This is a lot of information, and it's very difficult to convey all this information. Even with my notes on the computer, it's very difficult to put all this in words without some rambling, because I'm trying to think. My mind, while I'm talking, is trying to think, Kevin, how can you make this simpler? How can you explain this? And sometimes repeating it a little differently helps reinforce it. I am sorry I can't do all this in 20 minutes. It is what it is, and I'm going to make sure I'm giving you factual information, and information that's going to make sure you understand what's going on. So thank you for taking the time. I have thoroughly enjoyed this A-body series, and I have gotten a lot of requests for the Mopar A-bodies and the Mopar leaf springs, and I have leaf spring videos, but I've had a lot of requests for that. I'm getting a lot of questions around G-bodies. Every bit of this, every bit of it translates to the G-body. The A-body, the G-body, the B-body, they're all very similar with a few minor changes, but they're all triangulated 4 links from the factory. I thoroughly love the Gen 1 and Gen 2A bodies. We used to own a 66 Chevelle big block car, and Dad misses that car tremendously. Now he wound up with a 67 Dodge Coronet RT with a 440 with the Indy heads and a 4-speed and a Dana 60 with a 390 rear end. It came with 3 2s. And Dad did some modifications. He modified the 4-speed so that he could go first, second, third, fourth without ever using the clutch and never lifting off the accelerator. And I need to sit down with Dad and talk through what he did to that 4-speed to make that possible. But he had to disassemble the 4-speed and make a lot of changes and do some grinding. And what he did is he had the 4-speed set up, let me say it again, so that he could make the 1-2, 2-3, and 3-4 shifts without ever pressing in the clutch and never lifting on the throttle. And he said once he got it done and practiced and was able to do it, very rarely did he miss a shift. And the quickness that he picked up from not having to push a clutch in and change gears was tremendous. That little 67 Coronet RT with that 440 and 4-speed and the Dana 60 rear end and then the cam and Indy heads that it came with. Now he did wound up going one step bigger on the cam from Mopar, solid flat tappet cam. And he said that one of the worst mistakes he made was taking the 3 2s off and putting an 850 Holly on. He said actually the car slowed down, but he never went back to the 3 2s because the 3 2s frustrated him to no end. He was always fighting getting the 3 2s balanced. Now it had the progressive linkage and it ran on 2 barrels until you floored it, and then all 6 barrels came in. But he got so frustrated keeping those 2 barrels in tune that he took that off and put an 850 double pumper on. It still ran, it still won races, and we street raced that 67 all over South Carolina. My dad street raced that car, and I would go with him and Mama, it was a point of contention. But I can just say this, I was 5 to 8 years old in the span of that car, and it got to the point to where the highway patrol, the South Carolina Highway Patrol in Charleston, would sit outside our neighborhood and wait on Dad to pull out in that Coronet, and they would pull him and they'd write him tickets for your steering wheel's too small, you have modified exhaust, it's too loud, your headlights are too dim, your brake lights are too dim, I don't like the way you looked at me. And my dad ended up losing his license for a year. And me and Mama, I remember as plain as day, having to drive Dad to work and go pick him up. And there were days where my Mama couldn't get to him. And my daddy would hitchhike from Southeastern on Ashley Falls State Road back to North Charleston. And there were even times in the summer where he bought a 10-speed bike and he would ride his bike to work and home. He lost his license street racing. And more than once, me and Daddy were sitting in a cop car while they had a wrecker drag that 4-speed up on a flatbed, and Daddy cussing that highway patrol for letting that guy drag his car up on that flatbed without even putting the darn thing in neutral. I mean, emergency brake on, in gear and everything. And I can remember as a kid, and there were times I was scared. My dad was a hellion, man. And I learned a lot about street racing with my dad. But I remember my mom having to come pick me up because I wasn't riding. That highway patrol wouldn't put me in that cop car. And man, my highway patrolman, he would yell at my daddy for doing all of this and doing it with me with him. But you know what, man? Those were some memories. And I know I'm rambling. You can stop watching. We're done talking. I'm just sharing from the heart. But street racing, guys, as far back as I can remember, we were street racing. And yes, it was stupid. And yes, it was dangerous. And I don't recommend it. But it's in me. It's in my blood. And I remember when I was a junior in high school, my dad and I built a 77 Oldsmobile, which was the exact same thing as a 77 Nova. And we built a little 350. It probably made every bit of 375 horsepower. It had a set of double hump heads on it that I gasket matched and did a little port work on. And it had a little comp cams 280 flat tap head hydraulic cam. And we had a Victor Jr. on it with a 750 double pumper. And it had a set of lightweight pistons. I can't even remember who made the pistons back then. They weren't TRW. They were an aftermarket piston, and they were lighter than stock, and they were a true flat top. And other than that, it was a stock crank, stock rods, and we built that little motor. And we took the 7.5-inch 10-bolt rear end, and we put a set of 373 gears in it with a posi. It had a 700 R4 transmission in it. And with that first gear ratio and the 373s, man, and the leaf springs, and what Dad did is we took out that one heavy helper leaf spring. He took that out, lowered it down a little bit. I had a set of traction bars, and he bolted those on. And of course, that traction bar had a big rake on it, you know, and a big tall snubber. And Dad cut the snubber in half and heated the traction bar and bent the traction bar so right after the spring perch where it mounted with the U-bolts, he cut the snubber in half, bent the traction bar up so that you could put a sheet of paper between the snubber and the leaf spring. And he did both sides and set them the same. But what that did is that traction bar, you know, if you weren't careful and you hit a bump, it would dig into the road and jerk the rear end out of the car because of how much rake it had. And then also what it did is it gave the traction bar a little better angle, and we were able to put almost touching. We didn't want to create any load on it, but that little 77 Oldsmobile Omega, that thing would hook. And it had some separation. And it worked just like that. I mean, we didn't have cow tracks on it. I didn't have Smith & Wesson bars on it. They were stock springs. And he had a set, and what we did is we put a set of lightweight Moroso trick springs in the front, and it had 9010s on it. Now we're talking 1985, 86. And so we had a set of Lakewood 9010s in the front. We aligned the front end. It had stock upper and lower control arms, but he took the upper control arms off and took the bushings out and ground all the teeth off of the bushings and reinstalled them and tightened them up. But then it freed up the control arm. The control arm would actually pivot around the steel body of the bushing, and the rubber didn't create any binding. And so we did stuff like that, and that little 77 Oldsmobile, as heavy as it was, hatchback, two-door hatchback, I street raced the crap out of that thing. And I'm gonna save this for another video, but I was dating my wife and I street raced that car on Rivers Avenue. There was a little truck running around town telling everybody he could outrun me. And I went and found him one night at Robert's Barbecue on Rivers Avenue, the drive-in when it existed. And he pulled around in the Gaslight Square, and I pulled around in the Gaslight Square, and we had our conversation, and we talked about how much we wanted to put on it, and we went out and raced. And I remember Deborah, I asked if she wanted to get out, and she said, no, I'm not getting out here with all these people. I don't know any of these people. I don't know what's getting ready to happen, but I'm not getting out of this car. And I raced that guy on Rivers Avenue. And I'll tell you the rest of the story later. It did not end well. I won the race, but I almost went to jail. Anyways, thanks for listening, guys. I'm sorry for rambling at the end, but I just felt led to share that. So maybe somebody out there, maybe someone enjoyed it. I'm sure probably 3/4 of the viewers turned off the video and abandoned me at that point. But thank you for sticking with me. If you're here listening to me, thank you for all of your support. Thank you for watching to the end. I'm gonna ask, would you please consider giving this video a thumbs up? I really struggle with that, and YouTube really hurts my results and searches, because YouTube tells me, hey, your videos are not getting the thumbs up they should get with the amount of views they're getting. Would you please consider giving me a thumbs up, and would you please consider leaving a positive comment? That really helps the video, that helps my channel, and it's free. It doesn't cost you a thing to give me a thumbs up and leave a simple comment, even if your comment is nice. That helps my channel get better search results when people are searching on YouTube. I can't explain their algorithm, but if you would please consider doing that, that would be great. And I appreciate your views, because I'm not going to retire on YouTube money. And that's the God's honest truth. But what it does help is it helps cover chalkboards, microphones. It helps cover the editing time. And by the time I'm done, I'm losing money. But I enjoy giving this out to you for free. I enjoy creating these videos because I want to give back to the racing community. For so many years, my dad and others poured into me. And for so many years, YouTube channels have helped me. And they didn't cost me a thing. And I want to give back. I would be selfish to absorb all the knowledge and all the learning and not share it. And I have a lot of chassis guys tell me, you need to stop giving out all this information for free, because this is how we make our living. The chassis shops are going to continue to make a living, because over 90% of the racers out there refuse to learn this stuff. All they want to do is drive, and they're going to depend on a chassis shop to set up their car. They're not going to have a clue what's going on, but they're going to drive that car and win races. And when something goes wrong, they're not going to know what to do. They're going to take it back to the chassis shop. So this video channel is not putting chassis shops out of business. There's more work out there than people can handle for in-shop work. But remember, I offer in-shop services and I offer remote services. I have an email only remote service, and I have an email and phone call service. The email only is not as detailed, but we can make progress over a 24-hour period. The email and phone call, it costs more, but we go into a lot more detail. There's no 24-hour time limit, and then we have a call at the end. These are all on my website. They're all on my Facebook page. The links are in the description. Thank you. Remember, we're trying to do 3 things. We want to go fast, we want to go straight, and we want to be safe. Good night, guys. I'm going in and going to go to bed.